American biologist E.O. Wilson once said, "If all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago." If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. Insects are beautiful, fascinating, wonderful creatures that deserve conservation in their own right. But purely from a selfish perspective, we humans need to look after the insects, because if the insects were to disappear, then we too would follow them quickly to oblivion. Many people don't like insects, and I think that's terribly sad, because insects are vitally important. We should learn to love them, or at the very least respect them for what they do for us. Insects have been around for an extraordinarily long time. Their origins can be traced back to ancient marine fossils from 500 million years ago. And we know that all those years ago, the sea was full of different arthropods, small creatures with external skeletons, the ancestors of today's crustaceans and insects and spiders. And about 400 million years ago, arthropods started to crawl out of the sea onto the land. So this is a time long before dinosaurs existed, when there was very little on land at all, apart from a few mosses growing along the shores of the seas. The reasons for insects' success can be attributed to a number of evolutionary jumps that they made. They manage to develop a waterproof cuticle, a waterproof skin, which means that they can survive in arid environments where many other creatures would struggle to survive. Most importantly, one of the key innovations that insects came up with, they evolved the ability to fly. They were the first creatures to take to the air on Earth about 380 million years ago. And that gave them enormous advantages. It meant they could colonize new habitats, they could migrate, they could move south in the winter, they could escape from predators, or they could find prey by swooping down on them from the air. And in fact, some of the earliest insects were some of the biggest insects. Oxygen concentrations hundreds of millions of years ago were higher, and that helped insects to evolve into larger sizes. And the largest flying insect ever to exist was a dragonfly-like creature which swooped through the skies 300 million years ago. Very similar to dragonflies alive today. Aside from being able to fly, insects also evolved a very clever trick, which is metamorphosis. They evolved this strange life cycle where they change from an egg to a caterpillar or a larva via a pupal stage to an adult insect, which can look completely different to the immature insect. If you think of, for example, butterflies, where the caterpillar and the adult butterfly don't look in any way recognizable as being the same creature. And that provides advantages. It means you can have a caterpillar stage which is devoted to growing and eating. It doesn't need to be particularly fast moving or have good eyesight, but it does need to have good jaws and a good digestive system. Caterpillars are kind of designed for growing rapidly, as are other larval insects, things like maggots of flies. The adult insect is completely redesigned in the pupal phase and is usually quite short-lived and devoted to finding a mate and laying eggs. So the adults are much more mobile, they have better senses, usually better eyes, and a better sense of smell than the larval stages. And that specialisation into growth as a young insect and then into finding a mate and reproducing as an adult insect seems to be extraordinarily successful. The insect groups that can do that, the butterflies and moths, the beetles, the wasps, the ants and the flies, are amongst the most successful insect groups on Earth. Insects had one final evolutionary trick up their sleeve, which is that some of them went on to evolve to live in complex societies. Ants, bees, wasps and termites in particular do this, where they live in large groups of individuals with usually just one breeding female, the queen, and enormous numbers of sterile workers, each of which specialise in different jobs. For example, in ant colonies there may be individuals that specialise in defending the nest and have big jaws, and other individuals that stay within the nest and specialise in looking after the young or looking after the queen. Seems to be one of the most successful strategies on Earth in terms of numbers. Ants alone outnumber humans about 1,000,000 to 1. The biomass of ants and humans is roughly equal. Insects belong to a larger group of organisms called the arthropods, which means jointed feet. And includes things like centipedes and millipedes and spiders and scorpions and ticks. The reason all of these organisms have jointed feet is because they have an external skeleton, very different to humans, where we have a skeleton on the inside and flesh on the outside. Their rigidity is produced by an external skeleton like a suit of armour, which has to have joints to allow them to move, and their muscles and organs are protected inside this suit of armour. Insects are the most successful of the arthropods on land, and they are distinctive in a number of ways. All insects have 6 legs, which is a characteristic not found in the other arthropod groups, such as spiders, which of course have 8 legs. Insects have 3 body parts. The body is kind of arranged into 3 major sections. The head, which has the eyes and the antennae and the mouth parts, of course. The thorax, which is the middle section, which is usually full of muscles and has the limbs attached, the 6 legs, and usually 2 pairs of wings. And then the abdomen at the back, which contains the digestive tract and the reproductive organs. Insects are cold-blooded in the sense that their body temperature is usually close to that of the air temperature around them. They don't try to regulate their body temperature as mammals and birds do. So for example, humans, we have a stable body temperature and our body has a number of mechanisms to maintain it, whereas insects just allow their temperature to fluctuate. There are exceptions to this. There are some larger insects, such as bumblebees, dragonflies, and some larger moths, which produce heat internally by shivering their flight muscles and have mechanisms to lose heat if they become too warm. So for example, a bumblebee needs to get her internal body temperature above 30 degrees centigrade to take off. She does this by shivering, and the fur of a bumblebee helps to keep the heat in. And so there are some insects which are essentially warm-blooded like us mammals. The familiar buzzing noise that insects make is of course made by their flight muscles beating their wings up and down. Bumblebees flap their wings about 200 times a second to stay in the air, which sounds fast, but actually compared to some other insects is rather slow, which is why bumblebees make a low-pitched drone as they fly. In comparison, midges, the little tiny flies, some of which suck human blood and can be extremely annoying in a visit to northern parts of the world such as Scotland in the summer, they produce a much higher pitched whine because they're beating their wings at about 1,000 times a second to stay in the air. The wing beats of midges are amongst the fastest of all known wing beats on Earth. The brains of insects are of course much smaller than ours, but nonetheless some insects are capable of remarkably complicated behaviours and are, for example, able to learn. bees have to navigate between their colony and patches of flowers without getting lost. If they get lost on their way home, then they're doomed. And in fact, bees have become very good at memorizing landmarks, and they can use the sun and the Earth's magnetic field as a compass to prevent them from getting lost. They also can learn which flowers are most rewarding very quickly from the colour, the shape and the scent, which is a vital skill if you're going to efficiently collect nectar and pollen from large numbers of flowers to feed your hungry offspring back at the nest. Insects have evolved to feed on an enormous diversity of different foodstuffs. And hence their mouth parts have evolved into all sorts of different shapes and structures to facilitate them in their chosen feeding method. For example, a butterfly has a long, coiled, tube-like mouth that enables it to suck nectar from flowers. A mosquito has sharp, serrated, elongated mouthparts that it uses to stab into the flesh of its host to suck blood. Whereas a locust or a grasshopper or a beetle larvae may have large jaws for chewing through dense materials such as wood or leaves. The sensory organs of insects are mostly collected on the head. They have antennae which they use for scent, although they can also smell with their feet. They have compound eyes which are very different in structure to mammalian or human eyes. They don't provide the same level of visual acuity. Their eyes are divided into hexagonal cells, each of which uses one pixel in their image. That said, some insects have very large eyes, which means they have more of these eye cells, which means that the number of pixels in their vision is higher. Dragonflies are a good example of this. They have very large eyes which wrap around their head and enable them to see in all directions at once. Dragonflies need excellent vision because they specialize in snatching their insect prey out of the air in mid-flight, which obviously they can only do if they're able to see accurately. The breathing system of insects is very different to humans. Insects, rather than having lungs breathing through their nose and mouth, they breathe through holes on the sides of their body. They have a line of openings running along each side of their body which connect to tubes filled with air that spread through their body, through their tissues, and allow oxygen to diffuse into where it's needed, to the muscles in particular, and allow carbon dioxide to diffuse out. Insects are able to close down that breathing system. They can shut these little holes along their sides if they need to conserve moisture. But of course then they can't breathe, so they'll have to open them again before too long. They rely largely on diffusion, which is just the random movement of molecules to gain oxygen and lose carbon dioxide, rather than having a pumped system. But a few larger insects will pump their body up and down to squeeze these air tubes and move air in and out a little more rapidly to enable them to maintain high levels of activity, which of course require high levels of oxygen. An evolutionary biologist called J.B.S. Haldane was once asked in an interview what his studies had taught him about the nature of God, and his rather tongue-in-cheek reply was that God must be inordinately fond of beetles. Insects are vital to the survival of more or less all life on Earth, including ourselves. Insects make up the bulk of all biodiversity. We've so far named about 1.5 million species of animals and plants on our planet, of which about 2/3, about 1 million, are different types of insects, all sorts of different creatures. Wasps, beetles, butterflies, moths, earwigs, grasshoppers. There are many, many, many different types of insects. So they make up the bulk of life. They are also food for a great number of the animals that aren't insects. So for example, most bird species feed upon insects, as do most bats. Many lizards, frogs, newts, freshwater fish, they all depend upon insects. So if the insects were to disappear, then they too would disappear. Even humans eat surprisingly large amounts of insects. I say surprising because to Westerners in Europe and North America, we don't normally eat insects. This is slightly taboo, which is kind of odd because we happily eat their relatives, the shrimps and prawns and lobsters. 80% of the global human population regularly do eat insects. It's popular in South America, Africa, Asia, and actually insects are very nutritious. They're a good source of proteins and fats. They're also very efficient at converting plant protein and plant material into animal proteins that are better suited to our digestion. So insects are an important food source for both animals and for us. One of the many things that insects do in ecosystems. Because they're so numerous, they're involved in more or less every process you can think of. Many insects are predators, and many of them, such as ladybirds, hoverflies, lacewings and earwigs, are important biocontrol agents, so they help to eat our crop pests. Without them, it would be much harder for us to grow crops. Insects, of course, are also vitally important pollinators. 87% of all the plant species in the world require pollination by some kind of animal, almost invariably an insect. There are parts of the world where some pollination is done by birds, like hummingbirds, or even by bats. But in most of the world, pollination is delivered largely or entirely by one type of insect or another. Bees are most famous for this, but pollination is also done by butterflies and moths and different species of fly, and wasps and beetles and so on. Just in the UK, there are estimated to be about 4,000 different species of pollinating insect. Pollinators are not just important for pollinating wild plants, they're vitally important to us humans for pollinating our crops. If we didn't have pollinators, our supermarkets would not be full of all the beautiful fruits and vegetables we're used to seeing. Roughly 75% of all the crop species and varieties that we grow in the world require pollinating by insects. So if we didn't have insects, we wouldn't have strawberries or raspberries or blueberries or tomatoes or chili peppers or pumpkins or squashes. We wouldn't have things like coffee and chocolate. And we simply couldn't feed the 7.5 billion people on the planet without insect pollinators. Insects also perform a myriad of other ecological roles. For example, they're vitally important in nutrient cycles. They help to break down dead leaves and other organic matter and recycle the nutrients to make them available for plants to grow. Insects are masters at recycling dung and feces. Cowpats, for example, are rapidly colonised by dozens of different species of dung beetle and dung fly, which consume and bury the dung and recycle the nutrients therein. Similarly, when animals die, their bodies are rapidly broken down by maggots from blue bottles and green bottles, and by burying beetles, which drag the corpses of small animals underground and lay their eggs on them. One way or another, there's almost no ecological process that occurs on land that doesn't require insects. Insect declines have gone largely unnoticed other than by scientists, but there is one aspect of these declines which has been noticeable to anyone over a certain age, and this is sometimes known as the windshield phenomenon. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, perhaps into the 1980s, if you went for a long drive in the summer, then you had to stop every hour or two to clean the windscreen of your car because you no longer see it was covered in splatted insects. And that's something that simply doesn't happen anymore. You can drive for hundreds of miles in midsummer on a beautiful sunny day, and your windscreen will remain more or less clear. There's simply far fewer insects to hit. There is abundant evidence that insects are in rapid decline. There are many monitoring schemes for different groups of insects around the world. Insects in Britain are probably more closely monitored than anywhere else, and here we have monitoring schemes for butterflies and moths, and newer schemes for hoverflies and bees. And all seem to be in decline. But perhaps the most dramatic evidence for insect declines came from Germany, where amateur entomologists have been using malaise traps, which is a kind of trap that catches flying insects, since the late 1980s. And their studies have found that the biomass, the weight of insects caught per day in each of their malaise traps, fell by 75% over the last 26 years. So 3/4 of the flying insects in Germany seem to have disappeared. In the UK, we know that butterflies have declined dramatically. The more widespread butterfly species on average have declined by 44% since 1976. While the rarer species, despite many efforts to conserve them, have declined by 77% since 1976. Insect declines are being driven by a number of different factors. There is no one single cause. But probably the biggest driver is broadly loss of habitat. We used to have lots of natural and semi-natural habitats that were rich in flowers and rich in insects. In Europe in particular, we used to have hay meadows and chalk downland, flower-rich grasslands that supported an enormous diversity of insect life. But during the 20th century, we destroyed most of those habitats in the UK. We lost about 98% of all of our flower-rich grasslands in the 20th century, much of it replaced by cereal fields or silage fields, silage grown to produce fodder for livestock. Also lost other habitats, heathlands, woodlands, marshes and so on, mostly to intensified farming methods. Or to urban development, to factories, to housing estates, to roads and so on. Insects also face issues with diseases, particularly the spread of diseases beyond their native range, and one of the main causes of that has been the careless movement of honeybee hives around the world. Often hives are infected with very many different parasites and pathogens that attack viruses, bacteria, fungi, mites and so on. And sadly we've moved those around the world. And many of them are not confined to attacking honeybees. They will just as readily attack other insects such as bumblebees or hoverflies or wasps. For example, there is a mite called the Varroa mite, which originally came from Asia but has been accidentally spread all over the world and is now a major pest of honeybees. There are gut pathogens such as Nosema cerani, which also came from Asia. It's kind of Asian bee diarrhea, if you like, and has unfortunately been spread all over the world. Although it originated in honeybees, we think it now infects wild bumblebees very commonly in Europe, and it can be fatal to them. So that's undoubtedly not helping our wild bees to thrive. There are many other factors affecting insects. Climate change is starting to impact on some groups of insects, particularly bumblebees, which are cold climate specialists. They shiver to keep warm and they have a fur coat that helps them to keep warm, and so they're well adapted to coping with the kind of cold, wet climates that we often encounter in, for example, the UK. But they overheat in warm weather, and there's clear evidence that bumblebee ranges have been shifting northwards in the northern hemisphere. They've been disappearing from the warmer parts of their ranges. And these changes are projected to be quite profound in the coming decades. Light pollution is also impacting upon insects. Artificial light draws insects to them. We're not entirely certain why this happens, but it certainly can have fatal consequences. It leads to moths and other insects bashing themselves to death on street lights and on windows and so on. Or it concentrates them together and makes them very easy prey for bats and spiders and other insect predators. And it may also just disrupt their ability to behave normally, to find a mate and lay eggs. Synthetic pesticides were first introduced just after the Second World War. They, initially at least, were very effective. Insecticides removed more or less all insect pests to start with. People didn't really think through the negative aspects of using these chemicals, which include, of course, that they're also toxic to insects that you don't want to kill, including bees and other pollinators. Farming has become more and more dependent upon using large numbers of pesticides. The number of applications per field nearly doubled in the last 25 years. Farmers are using more and more of these chemicals, and they're becoming more widely available in developing countries. This is contributing to insect decline. In the UK, each arable field is now treated on average about 17 times a year. It receives 17 different pesticide applications. That could be one pesticide applied 17 different times, or 17 different pesticides each applied once. But either way, that's a barrage of chemicals. In total, in the UK, we apply about 16.9 thousand tonnes of pesticides per year to the farmed landscape. And that doesn't include domestic use or use by local authorities in parks and so on. One particular group of insecticides have become controversial with regard to their role in driving bee declines and more broadly wild insect declines, and that's the neonicotinoids, which are a group of chemicals related to nicotine that are synthetically created in the lab. They were invented in the 1990s and became commercially available in 1994. And proved to be very popular initially with farmers. The main way they were used was as a seed dressing, so the farmers would buy seeds pre-coated with this new insecticide, and they would simply sow the seeds in the ground. There was no need for the farmer to spray insecticide from the back of a tractor, which obviously is attractive to the farmer. It's less work, it's less trouble, and also would appear to be quite an efficient system because it avoids the drift of insecticides on the wind, which can happen if they're applied as a spray. Unfortunately, there turned out to be a downside to these chemicals. So the way they're designed to work is the seed goes into the ground and the chemical is water soluble and it dissolves into the damp soil water. And then as the seedling grows, it sucks up the chemical, and they're systemic, so they go to all parts of the crop. And make them poisonous to any kind of herbivorous insect. Which sounds great from a farmer's perspective, but unfortunately actually it turns out that most of the pesticide isn't taken up by the crop at all. About 95% of it remains in the soil and then leaches into rivers where it can harm aquatic insects. Or it can accumulate in the soil if the farmer uses a neonicotinoid treated seed every year, and they can also be taken up by wildflowers growing in the field margin and by the hedgerow plants and the hedgerow trees growing around the crop. So we now end up in a situation where it turns out, after these chemicals have been used for a couple of decades, the soils and rivers and hedgerows are all contaminated with these insecticides. And they're quite persistent. Once they get into woody plants or into the soil, they can last for several years. And they're incredibly toxic to insects of all types. Toxicity of insecticides is normally measured by an LD50, which stands for the lethal dose that kills 50% of test organisms. And the LD50 for the most commonly used neonicotinoid insecticides for honeybees is about 4 billionths of a gram, which is an infinitesimally small amount. That means that 1 teaspoon of one of these neonicotinoids, 5 grams, is enough to kill 1.25 billion honeybees. But the industry that manufactures these chemicals goes to great lengths to claim that these chemicals don't harm the environment. They argue that somehow they miraculously manage to kill only the bad insects, the insect pests, without harming bees or butterflies or beetles or whatever, the insects we don't want to damage. It's just not possible to spray the landscape with poison without harming insects you don't intend to harm, without collateral damage. They deny any link between their chemicals and insect declines. They publish their own research, they employ their own scientists who invariably find that their products are harmless to the environment. And at the same time, they try to discredit and undermine any evidence to the contrary, any work from independent scientists which seems to show that their products are harmful to bees or to the environment in general. They lobby, they confuse, they sow doubt. They use, in fact, a whole suite of tactics which were well practiced by the tobacco industry in the 20th century and have simply been rolled out to defend pesticides in the 21st century. Local authorities spray our streets with pesticides, and householders, homeowners, gardeners buy pesticides in huge numbers. You only have to go to a supermarket or a garden centre or a DIY store to see rows and rows of shelves with different types of pesticide. Even if you don't use any pesticides in your own garden, and many of us these days try to garden organically, pesticide-free, you may inadvertently be poisoning your garden via your dog or cat. Vets will often advise pet owners to prophylactically treat their dog or cat against fleas. And this treatment involves dripping an insecticide onto the neck of the dog or cat once a month, 12 months of the year. Now, what people rarely stop to think about is that these are really potent insecticides. The commonly used brands involve either a compound called imidacloprid or another called fipronil. Both of them are neurotoxins, are incredibly toxic to insects. Imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid insecticide. It's now banned for use in farming. And in fact, the dose of imidacloprid that your vet will recommend that you drip onto the neck of your dog every month is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. They'll stay on the dog for weeks or months until it gets wet, and then they'll wash off because they're water soluble. If your dog goes out in the rain and then shakes itself in the garden, that's going to be a shower of insecticide all over your garden. Or worse still, if it jumps in the pond or in a stream, that's a whole bunch of insecticide washing into that stream. These two compounds, imidacloprid and fipronil, are both turning up in almost every river in England at concentrations likely to be harmful to aquatic insect life. Rivers are now running with insecticides. Farmers don't just apply pesticides to their fields, they also apply large quantities of fertilizer. Most of us might think that that's less likely to have adverse impacts on the environment than pesticides. Fertilizers just help plants to grow more quickly, surely. But in fact, this widespread application of fertilizer has had really negative impacts on the environment by making the soils much more fertile than they used to be. But Britain used to have huge areas of beautiful wildflower meadows that had been cut for hay for centuries. You simply have to apply a sack of fertilizer to one of those meadows to destroy it, nothing more than that. Because if you do so, the grasses will shoot up. They respond much more positively to the high fertility. And they'll crowd out and shade out all the flowers, and you'll quickly end up with a field of grass and no flowers and no wildlife. These fertilizers, when they're applied to arable crops, they get into the soil and the soil water, and they leach into the field margins. And then this burst of fertility in the field margins means that some plants that really like high fertility soils, things like nettles and docks, really thrive. So our field margins these days tend to be dominated by a few coarse plants that like high fertility conditions. The flowers that used to thrive in our hedgerows have disappeared. Fertilizers also run off into streams and rivers and cause what's called eutrophication, where the high fertility leads to algal blooms, which can be very toxic and basically smother and poison the natural freshwater fauna and flora. Taken what was once a landscape full of flowers and bees and butterflies and birdsong and turned it into a desolate, hostile land where just the crop can survive. And this is undoubtedly contributing to the overall decline in the insect population. Unlike many of these big conservation issues like climate change or rainforest destruction, we can easily get involved in halting the decline of insects. This is because insects live all around us. They live in our gardens, they live in our parks, they live on road verges. They live all around us. There is a study from a little Leicestershire garden where a lady spent 30 years cataloguing insects in her garden. She found about 2,000 species in her small suburban garden. So it's like a miniature rainforest. There's extraordinary biodiversity out there in our immediate surroundings. If we look after it in a wildlife-friendly way, there's enormous potential to combat insect declines by getting people to make their gardens into havens for insects. Mow a little less, but mown lawn is a pretty hostile habitat for most wildlife. It doesn't support terribly much. But if you stop mowing, it's amazing how many flowers appear. Just allow wildflowers to thrive in your garden. Imagine, in the UK for example, we have about 500,000 hectares of gardens. That's a bigger area than all the nature reserves in Britain put together. If we could make most of those gardens insect friendly, we could then also influence the council so that the city parks were full of bee-friendly flowers. And the road verges were managed for wildflowers, the cemeteries and all the other bits of green space that link up the gardens. You'd have this vast network of insect-friendly habitat stretching right across the UK, maybe right across Europe. The current system of industrialised farming, with big farms, huge fields, mechanisation, repeated applications of pesticides and fertilisers, and typically a very small range of crops being grown, is just not sustainable in the long term. It's making huge contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. It's driving erosion and degradation of soils around the world, and of course it's a major contributor to the collapse of biodiversity, including the disappearance of our insects. We need to find a different way of growing food. We need to move towards smaller farms, diversified farms, growing a much greater range of crops, including many more fruits and vegetables, which are needed for a healthy human diet, which would allow for much more complex rotations, which helps in managing pests without having to use pesticides. We need to look at farming methods that rely on natural enemies rather than pesticides to control those pests. And there are some wonderful examples already out there: organic farming, permaculture, biodynamic farming, agroforestry. We need to take these alternative types of farming seriously and take the best from them and combine them to come up with a way of producing food and feeding the world that is truly sustainable, that works with nature rather than against it. should be encouraging more people to grow their own food. If you look at allotments, for example, they're wonderfully diverse places with dozens of different crops being grown in small patches. They can be incredibly productive. The more competent allotmenters can get the equivalent of 35 tons of fresh fruit and veg per hectare of allotment. That's 0 food miles, 0 packaging, often no pesticides. That compares really well with industrial farming, where, for example, wheat crops typically produce about 8 tonnes per hectare, with all those chemicals and all the associated environmental damage. Allotments are amongst the most biodiverse places in our urban areas, more biodiverse than gardens, parks, even more biodiverse than urban nature reserves. You can have wildlife thriving in places where you produce lots of food. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. There is no planet B. We inherited a beautiful, extraordinary planet with incredible biodiversity, perhaps 1.5 million species or more, clinging to the surface of a rock hurtling through space. It's mind-boggling if you stop to think about it. And we're incredibly lucky to have this place that is our home and provides us with everything we need. But why are we making such a terrible mess of it? Polluting the soils, the streams, the seas, the air with all sorts of plastics and heavy metals and pesticides and fertilizers. And we're chopping down the forests, we're wiping out biodiversity. There is a real danger that future generations will inherit a world that's lost most of its natural beauty. We have to do better than that, and we can do better than that, and it seems to me that a really nice place to start is by looking after the little creatures, the insects that live all around us.